And some more thoughts with you. And this morning I want to talk about basically, well, we always talk about relationships in church because relationships is the stuff of life. But I want to talk about and remind us this morning and myself that how we communicate with each other is important. And my memory goes back to when I was pastoring. And a lot of younger people like to do the text message thing now. I'm not so crazy about that, and I'll tell you why. Because sometimes somebody will send something, and I don't know in what context they're sending it in. They could be mad, they could be unhappy about something, or they could be okay. It could be perfectly fine, and it's really hard sometimes to understand what is being conveyed to you. And, our humanness sometimes makes us so that, the way I see it is the way other people see it, not necessarily so. But I think it's important, it's good to speak to one another is what I'm saying. I like to talk to people face to face. If there's a problem or something that needs to be dealt with, that's where I come from. Thank you, John Lynn, for that text, for reading that scripture this morning. And I want to talk this morning. First off, I want to talk about my mother, and this is going to be for a few minutes. She turned 93 not too long ago. Wonderful lady. She is, to have to put up with me and my brother sometimes, and the rest of my siblings. We were all kind of and she's made it to 93 is quite an accomplishment because in spite of us, But a great lady, she always cared for us, she always fed us, she always took care of us, she always made sure everything was where it needed to be and what we needed and stuff. But there was another thing I think that made her really special too. And it's not something that I can brag about for myself or anything. But my mother, what made her great too, is she could be tough when she wanted to. There was a time, I remember when I was 6 or 7 years old, and after school I went to a friend's house, and we were playing with his I don't know what they have these days, but in those days we had a lot of army stuff. So it was little green soldiers and stuff you had molded out of plastic, and you have the little planes and tanks and things like that. So we're playing with these, and I really, really liked those planes. I've always been kind of an aviation enthusiast, but I really liked those planes. And got into my head, because I usually didn't think this way, I want those planes. And so what did I do? When he wasn't looking, I grabbed 2 or 3 and I put it in my pocket, and I went home. Well, later on, after I got home, my friend's mother phoned, and she talked to my mom. So my mom managed to talk with her and stuff. Then she put down the phone and she said, Stewart, did you take something that didn't belong to you? What could I say? I was busted. I was absolutely busted. And so I said, yes, Mom. She says, okay, get your stuff on. We're going to drive over to their place right now, and you're going to give it back, and you're going to apologize for that. And that was just the worst feeling I could have. I felt bad enough being busted by my mom, but to have to admit this to another lady and stuff, and to my friend. But nevertheless, we went. She made me go, and we talked about this, and I apologized with my head looking at my belly button. I couldn't look her in the eye that I had done this to her and my friend. But it was what I needed to have. And my mom also did that with my younger brother, because one time when he was a little guy, him and my cousin went over to Woodward's, and this is how long ago this was, went over to Woodward's when they were kids, and they took golf balls. They're not even 10 years old, and they're taking golf balls. They've never golfed a stroke in their life. I don't know what prompted them to take that. But anyway, my mom found that out, so she marched them back to Woodward's, and they had to give them back, and they had to tell the manager what they had done. That's tough, but that's a good mom. That's I don't know what your experience is, if you ever had any of that, but sometimes tough mums are good mums. And tough love is good love. Sometimes being able to love is really difficult. We're created to love. We were created for relationship, and part of relationship is to love. And sometimes that's not always an easy thing to do. And sometimes to love someone involves a thorough serving of tough love. And as difficult as it may be, it's not just important for Christ followers, it's vital. See, as Christians, how we communicate with each other, how we say what needs to be said, will make or break our relationships. The Apostle Paul writes this in Romans 13:8. Owe nothing to anyone except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. Later on, he goes on to say, love your neighbor as yourself. The law is fulfilled in love. Now, knowing that we are God's people, and that we are to love, that we were called to love, there's a part of me that can say, hey, that's great. I was made for love by God. I've been redeemed for love by God. I'm commanded to love. Hey, I can do that. And yet, when we turn around and try to do that, it's not always easy. Sometimes it's difficult. It's hard, and it can be downright tough because some people are downright unlovable, it seems to us. However, the word that Paul uses for love is not emotional love. It's actionable love. It's not an affectionate love. It's an effective love, and there's a difference. The word for that, as most of you will already know, is agape. It's been defined by Christians as loving by choosing the good of the other, or put another way, to will the good of the other. See, it's not about choosing to have good feelings about someone. We're commanded to choose the good of the person that we claim to love. And if you've ever tried to do that with people you don't like, you'll quickly realize that that kind of love is going to cost you something. And it will cost you big time. And the reason for that is hard is because that kind of love will always involve sacrifice on our part. And quickly we realize that that kind of love is hard and it's tough. When we think of the phrase tough love, we think of parents who allow their children to experience the consequences, as I told you before, of what they've chosen to do. And sometimes tough love involves giving the person what they need rather than what they want. Sometimes tough love involves telling someone the hard but necessary truth, the thing that they need to hear. So to practice tough love means to be willing to say the thing that needs to be said to that person. So for instance, when we have something that needs to be said to a brother or a sister, a family member, say, or a friend, somebody in the church, the fact that we are in these relationships makes it that we have the responsibility to do that. It's not an option with us, folks, if we are Christ followers. And that's what Jesus is saying to us. See, we have to be the person that says what needs to be said. And how we say that is as important as what we say to that person. In Ephesians 4, when Paul tells us that we need to say what has been said, what has to be said, he's telling us to avoid all evil and despiteful talk. And to do that by saying only the good things that people need to hear. Seriously, you'd say? Yeah. So what does that mean? That means to refrain from blaming, from judging. And a big one in our families, in our relationships, in the church, I have to say, gossiping. It's one of the 7 deadly sins, and there's a good reason for that. See, we don't talk with evil and malicious talk. And what we do, we say the kind of things to people when we talk to them, folks, as people of the risen Savior, Jesus Christ. We talk to them in ways that will not make people defensive and withdraw from us and to cause them to put up walls to us. That's not what we're about. What we do is we say the kind of things that really need to help them. And if our relationship gives us a responsibility to say what needs to be said, the first thing we need to avoid is saying some things that are not good. Things like evil and malicious talk. What does evil and malicious talk mean? Well, that means avoiding all unnecessary negatives. As I told you before, gossiping, grumbling, complaining, being critical. And you know what the worst part of that is? And we've all been here. I've been here. And we need to really be vigilant about this. Negatives can also bond us to each other. It's one way we make connections, and it's everywhere. You know, one thing is, say, just for instance, this is a very mild one, but say, what did you think of that weather we had this weekend? What do you think we had of this weather a while ago, in the summer? Or in May before all the fires came through here. Well, I probably thought, yeah, it was a nice time. Weather was good. Another guy, yeah, the weather was good. But it was so hot. I had to stay inside. So all I could do was basically go downstairs and nap until it got cool enough so I could go back up. Yeah, it was pretty hot, wasn't it? See what I mean? That's nothing major, but what I'm saying is those things, negatives can slip in there. And here's one to think about. How about for tomorrow, no complaining? No complaining. Well, that sounds easy, but it's not, because subconsciously, we can always be looking for the negative. And we have to be careful. See, a family member of mine, and I'm not going to share his name or whatever, or what it's all about, but he's going through some real problems. And it's affecting the whole family. That's another thing we don't think about, when we carry these negative things. They affect, it's like the ripples on a pond once you've dropped a pebble in. They affect everybody. We've tried to be kind with him and stuff, but he drives us crazy, because if we were to tell him something that would help him, he says, "You don't understand. You don't know what I need. Who are you to tell me where I'm at? Or you can't tell me what's wrong with me. You guys don't get it." And the worst thing is that he's absolutely toxic. And why is he? Because he hasn't learned to forgive. And folks, we need to let go of that stuff quick. And I know that's not easy. Believe me, you're coming from someone who knows, who has practiced the opposite. It's not easy. But you know what? At the root of his, all his reluctance, he will not forgive people, and that way he cannot let go of the anger and resentment. And I see what it's doing to him, physically and mentally and spiritually. And so when I was doing this message, it really made me think. See, when you approach somebody like that, we need to have some grace and compassion for each other. The church sometimes does not have that, folks. We are not very gracious to each other at times. And it's sad to say, but it's true. We sing it, we talk about it, we learn about it, but we don't always practice it. And this is the first place we should show grace, because the church really is a hospital for broken people. That's what it is. So getting back to my brother, what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to approach him with compassion and with love. I need him to know that I love him. And as a Christian, my responsibility is to help him discover his potential for his highest good and his greatest happiness. In fact, as that is for all of us, we are there to help each other with that. And so what that's going to require of me is to take the time and make the effort to dig deeper, to listen to, so that I can compassionately understand the forces that are at work within him. And I have to give him some grace, because sometimes people who we will come up against don't even realize they have those behaviors. It's become such an intrinsic part of ourselves that, we don't think we have a problem, but somebody else sees what's doing that. And it's like a guy I know in my golf group. I mean, I've had problems with him because he comes across as arrogant. He's a Christian, he says. He comes across as arrogant. He comes across as a bit of a bully. And I said to one of the guys who makes up the teams, I said, I don't want to play with him. It's no fun. But you know what I have to do? I can't avoid him forever. I guess one of the other fellas told him what we were thinking. And I think he's slowly getting the message. But then maybe I need to go up and talk with him too, because God has commanded me to do that. It's hard. You'd rather just walk away or sidestep or avoid it if you could, but you can't. It's always there. It seems so much easier to avoid the hard conversations. In avoiding the conversation, we end up, folks, avoiding the person. And you can't love a person when you're avoiding them. It's a fact that negative emotions are more powerful than positive ones. If you don't believe me, just listen. Next time you're with some people, you go out for lunch or something like that, see what they talk about. They talk about the government, or they talk about what the city is doing wrong or something like that. I really felt that at my men's breakfast this weekend. And I said, I'm not one to preach, because I'm not, but I would just sat back and I looked at them all and saying, aren't we cynical this morning, And they all kind of laughed. I guess we are, It's a natural thing that works. And the negative is very powerful. Yeah, we think it's so easy to fall into this trap. And sometimes we think that the only way we'll be able to truly love someone is to avoid the negatives altogether. And why do we do that? When we think we can avoid the negatives, we think we can guard our hearts. A person will come to us and with good news or bad news and want us to enter into their joy or sorrow, and what do we sometimes do? We stonewall, we sidestep, or we change the subject. We won't engage relationally because we will not respond to their conversation. Sometimes nobody talks about it. It's the elephant that's in the room, but nobody talks about it. And we'll try to just make everything seem to be fine. We'll try to paper over the cracks. And that only works for so long. And the saddest thing is that happens in a lot of marriages. You stop talking. You stop communicating. You stop sharing genuinely and authentically and lovingly and relationally. And when people stop talking in relationships like that, they start to hold each other in contempt. They stop loving one another because you can't love someone when you're going out of your way to avoid them. Happens in any number of marriage relationships all the time. We'd rather avoid the tension and the hassles and enter into a difficult time in a relationship because it's going to come at a personal cost. You know, there were some conversations I didn't want to have as a pastor because I knew what was coming. And I didn't want to be the person to initiate the conversation. But you know what? Sometimes, and I used to call it swallowing the frog. Sometimes, folks, we have to swallow the frog. We need to take the initiative. We need to be the ones who are the peacemakers, who are the conflict resolvers. See, if you love someone enough, you'll stop avoiding those hard conversations. And in order to help somebody, you need to say what you need to say, which means you need to say it to them, and you do it as Paul said in his scripture. He said, you just go to that person and talk first. Don't have anybody else, just go first and do that. And later on, if you need somebody, if there's a problem in the church, then you take 2 or 3 people. But you go to that person yourself. The first step toward doing that is to listen. Really listen, folks. That's the big one we do not do so easily. We have to listen to what's going on in that person's life. We have to go beyond the shallow part, and as tough as it is, we got to dig down in some layers. What's the real reason they're upset? What's the real reason they're taking out their anger on everybody? Because people usually don't do that. But if they do it constantly, if they do it enough, there's something not right there, deep down. And so we need to be good listeners if we're going to have this, if we're going to be able to resolve these conflicts. And that's something, it doesn't just come to us, some of us. You have to work at it. You have to practice it. But we can all learn from practicing that. You see, when I'm willing to humble myself and listen to them, truly listen to them, and let them know they're heard, I'm doing the right thing. Because what am I doing if I'm not doing that? I'm making judgment calls from a distance. I get it in my head, this is the way these people are, or this is the reason why they're acting the way they're acting, and I can be right out of line. That's not what we're called to do. Talk to them directly. And one thing I use, just a little tool that I have in my toolbox, when I'm talking to somebody about something that's not good, have you ever heard the iMessage? iMessage. I tell them how, I say I, and I tell them how it affects me. I don't say you. Because if I say you, what's going to happen? Their spirits are going to close. Their hearts are going to get hard and stony, and I'll have lost a brother or sister. But if I say this about myself, I don't give them a place to be hostile. I just tell them how I'm feeling about this, and sometimes you have to do that a few times. But I don't know of a better way to start to initiate healing in a relationship than to talk about it that way and to stay in that place. See, when you use the iMessage, you don't blame, judge, or criticize the other person when you practice that. Now, I've heard it said by someone that a good Christian ought to be more ready to give a favorable interpretation to another statement than to condemn it. And to do that means we need to allow them to come to us from their perspective, from their way of thinking, from their way of observing. And then let's talk. And then the goal of saying what you need to say is not to vent. Because you're upset or things aren't the way you'd like them to be, we need to say words that will actually help the other person. And we need to do that because love is willing the good of the other, working, as I said, toward their highest good and greatest happiness. Because of our relationships, we have the responsibility to say what Paul was essentially saying. Say only the good things that people need to hear, things that will really help them. Well, does this need to be said by me? Couldn't it be said by somebody else? Couldn't I get my pastor to go do that or something? You know, it might actually have to come from you. The good news is that if you're doing that, what are you doing? You're opening that person into relationship. When you're loving them enough and you're going to listen to them and you're going to care about them and you're going to help in that healing process, you know what you're doing? The beautiful thing is you're proclaiming and you're sharing the gospel with them. If you love them, you're going to really care about their soul. That's what we're about. You'll love them through and through with the eyes of Jesus while keeping an eternal perspective in mind that this world doesn't count for much, but folks, our life is eternal. And there's a lot more going on after this. And we need to keep that in mind when we're talking with these folks as well. Now, sometimes you're not going to have the results you'd like. It's going to happen. Do your part, though, because then you can walk away with a clear conscience. And you know what? You won't hate them. You might not be able to talk with them for a while. But you know, your heart will be changed as well when you do that. You'll be more and more in keeping what Christ has always desired for you to be and wants you to walk like. We love them enough. We love those who are unlovely. We love them enough to tell them the truth. And remember, it was Paul who said, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, and to love one another when it's tough." Because, folks, it's going to be costly. It means I'm not going to love them enough to avoid them. I'm going to love them enough to speak. It's difficult and it's hard. And it's tough love. Here's the thing. If we don't love others in the way they need to be loved, then who is going to say these words? And my prayer for you and my prayer for me and all of the church, that it will be us who will say it. And we will love them just like Jesus loves us. God bless you as you go forward this week.